and I'm going to end the poll as well. And well, let me welcome today's speaker, Tom Beeks, who's a trainer at the Bell Foundation. I think many of you will already know Tom, but for those who don't, Tom has worked in English language education since 2003. He has taught around the world and is particularly interested in international education and teacher development. As you may also know, Tom helped create the Bell Foundation's Language for Results International suite of online training, and he also works as an assessor for our ALFRE accreditation program. And in today's webinar, Tom will explore how Dictogloss can be used to support both language and content learning across the curriculum. If you've got any questions during the webinar, please feel free to put them in the chat as they come to you. I will collect them, and then at the end of the webinar, I will pose the questions to Tom. In the next couple of days, you will receive an email from us with a link to the recording of the webinar and also any links to resources or pages that Tom will be mentioning today. So don't worry too much about writing those down. Well, but now it's time to pass over to today's speaker. So over to you, Tom.
Thank you very much for such a nice introduction, Shaka, and welcome everybody. It's great to see so many people from all kinds of different places joining us today. And let's get started. So here's what we're planning to cover today. We're going to look at exactly what a dictogloss is and sort of define that. So hopefully that's a bit clearer. We'll look at how it's useful for our EAL learners, and then we're also going to look at the practicalities of how you actually go about using it in your classroom, and we'll look at different examples of ways you could use it, and we'll look at some different types of activities and ways you can adapt those for different proficiency levels as well. And hopefully that's so that you can incorporate this activity into your teaching repertoire, and that your EAL learners in particular will be able to develop their language skills effectively alongside other things like their language awareness and metacognition, which is one of the great strengths, I think, of using this activity. So let's start at the beginning. This is a map of what we're going to do today, and I want to start off by explaining and defining exactly what we mean by this word dictogloss. I don't know how many of you here have come across the term before, but certainly it's a type of it's an activity that turns up mainly in English language or language learning contexts. So for me, I first encountered it when I was teaching English as a second language. And it's a type of supported or scaffolded dictation activity. And again, for clarity, by dictation activity, we mean when a student listens to a text and writes down what they hear. It's what it sounds like. And as I mentioned, these are quite common in language learning classrooms, but I don't know the extent to which they get used in non-language learning contexts. Although this is something that happens quite often indirectly, doesn't it? So a teacher, for example, asking students to copy down a set of instructions or questions. But a dictogloss goes beyond a simple dictation, and it's a blend of the words dictation and gloss. And gloss, I mean, in the sense of an explanation to make something clearer, such as a note that's added to a text. And the ultimate purpose of a dictogloss is to help our learners gain greater clarity and understanding about the text that we are using for the dictation. So in its most basic form, a dictogloss looks like this. The students listen to a text. This could be read by a teacher or using a recording. The students then write down what they can remember. This could be words, sentences, chunks, whatever they can manage. The students will listen again and repeat the process. And again, this can happen multiple times depending on how you want to set up the activity. And then students work together to reconstruct the text as closely as possible. And then the final stage is noticing the gap. This is where students compare their text with a copy of the original transcript of what they've just listened to. And that's where they can notice, how their version is different to the version they listen to. And a lot of learning can happen in that space. We'll talk about that in more detail later in the webinar. So why is a dictogloss useful for our learners? Well, there are loads of great reasons, I think, for using a dictogloss. First of all, it practices multiple skills. Of course, there's listening and writing because it's a dictation activity, but there are also lots of opportunities for speaking, and reading comes into it as well. A dictogloss activity kind of organically raises awareness of language, and it requires or encourages at least the use of meta language. And it encourages learners to notice things like pronunciation and spelling relationships, word order, punctuation, things like that. And connected to this, it's particularly good for focusing on details of grammar. Students have to attend to different conjugations of verbs, for example, or the use of different grammar words like prepositions or conjunctions. They also need to pay attention to the choice of verb tense being used. And it can really help build familiarity with text structure. So this can work at both the word or sentence level, how you build up words into sentences, but also how you connect sentences together to make paragraphs, and longer texts as well. It builds that familiarity of and the understanding of text structures and how they're built. Second to last, it's a collaborative activity. So again, it's really great for students being able to share knowledge between each other and again build confidence communicating with each other. And last but not least, it builds metacognition. This is the idea of learning how to learn. So, for example, it will help learners think about things like what do they find easy or difficult when they're listening to English? What kind of things will help them understand better when they're listening to a text? And what kind of strategies can they use when they don't understand every single word? Is that even important? These are the kind of questions that this activity can help students answer. And Dictogloss activities, they're great for students. They're also, I think, really great for teachers too. And that's because they tend to be very low in preparation time. They are very versatile. They can be used in any subject area with any topic. And they can also be used very effectively with mixed ability groups. And that could be in terms of content knowledge or language proficiency or both. So based on the description of a dictogloss that I've just laid out to you there, I am interested of the people attending, how many of you have actually done what I've described? Has anyone tried a dictogloss before with their students? A simple yes or no in the chat. That's absolutely fine if the answer is no. That's quite a surprising number of yeses. Excellent. It's absolutely fine if it's a no, because it's not an activity that is necessarily one of the most wider known ones. That's a really good comment. Yes, but it didn't make a lot of sense to me at the time. Well, hopefully this webinar is going to clarify some of the things, because I agree that I've also looked at a lot of materials and sometimes it will say like, do a dictogloss. And it's not actually clear what that means to people. All right, I'll move on. Thank you for your sharing your comments. So in this section, we'll look at the practicalities then. What does it actually look like when we're doing one with our students? Somebody's asking recommended for which age? Well, we'll come to that a little bit in the next section. But I think potentially they can be used at any age where students are able to write reasonably independently, because there's a large writing focus to the task. And if you want to do a Dictogloss, there are, I think, 5 basic steps that I would go through as a teacher when doing a Dictogloss. So first of all, I need to choose a text. Second of all, I need to plan how I'm going to do the process and adapt it to my learners' needs. And this doesn't have to be a complicated or time-consuming thing. It's just maybe something I need to take a moment to think about. Thirdly, do the Dictogloss. And as part of the Dictogloss, you're always going to need to build in as well a time for comparison and reflection, at the noticing the gaps, because this is where the learning really comes in. And lastly, if you've gone through all the effort to do an activity based around this text in a lot of depth and detail, then you need to exploit that text. So there's going to be activities that are based on that text, both for linguistic and curricular learning. So, you've put the time in to do the Dictogloss, you might as well get the benefit from that by exploiting the text for learning. So I'm going to go into detail about each of these stages in a moment. And we'll begin with how to choose a text. And there are 2, I think, broad types of text you might want to use as your text in a Dictogloss. The first is a model. So this would be an exemplar of something we want our students to be able to produce themselves. So typical examples would be exam answers, especially kind of medium length answers like those 1 to 2 paragraph exam items that are very common. So we're talking about more than a single sentence or word, but not as much as a whole essay. It's also useful for essay extracts, individual parts of a longer text. So, for example, an opening or closing paragraph, or what is often described as peel paragraphs, which are very common in a lot of schools in the UK. That's point, evidence, explanation, link, peel, which is, again, a typical paragraph structure that we train students to use to be successful in exams, in particular in an essay writing as well. And the third thing you might want to think about is a genre text. So those of you who are language specialists will understand what I mean here, but the everyday meaning of genre, of course, is when we are talking about different kinds of movie or book, such as thriller, comedy, or drama, and so on. But for linguists or language teachers, genre just means any kind of text type that has its own distinct characteristics. So we mean things like it could be an email, a diary entry, a short story, a science experiment methodology, or another part of a science experiment, your analysis, whatever the different sections will have their own different characteristics. Essentially, any text type that you want them to be able to replicate in the classroom. Okay. The second kind of area of text you might want to explore are what I would call key input. So that's a text that has important information that we want learners to understand deeply and that will be used for further tasks. So ideally, this is a text that the students are going to be working with a lot, or an idea that they're going to be working with a lot. So this might include a text that's describing a process or a problem. For example, this could be an explanation of a scientific process. It could be a maths word problem. It could be a scenario or a dilemma that students have to explore or solve. So it could be also used as a way to introduce a project by setting up that central question. Could also be used to provide information about a person or a place. for example, information about a historical figure, a short biographical description, or a description of a place for a geography case study of some kind, something like that. And of course, it's also going to be useful in a literature context. So a kind of literary passage. And by that, I mean any kind of key passage from a text that students might have to write an exam answer about, or it could be a key extract from a storybook or a novel or something like that, or a play, which contains a core plot moment that you need the students to really get their heads around to understand the text properly. And of course, the text we choose could be a combination of both of these things. It could be a model text, but it could also have key input in it as well. But we do need to be careful that we're not overwhelming our learners with too much to think about at the same time. So it's often helpful to kind of distinguish between these two text types. So next then is a little bit of planning. How are we going to actually conduct our Dictogloss? And as I mentioned before, this doesn't have to take a long time, but these are some things that you might want to consider before doing the activity. First of all, how many repetitions of the text will you use? How many times will the students hear it? It's good to have a rough idea of how many times you want them to do it, but you may need to adapt it to the situation. I would say 3 is probably an optimum number, but you definitely don't want more than sort of 4 or 5 because it starts getting quite boring. And I would also say that if students need to listen more than kind of 4 or 5 times, then that's a sign that the text you've chosen is pitched too high, and it's not actually going to be very useful for them if they're struggling that much to access the text. Second is the kind of scaffolding you might need, and we'll touch more on options for that later. Thirdly, you want to think about the groupings and who do you want working together. So students will work in pairs typically for a Dictogloss, but also in small groups of 4s or 5s or 6s perhaps. And so it can work well to mix up different language proficiencies for this task so that there can be sort of knowledge sharing going on. You also want to consider whether you're going to read out the text yourself or use a recording. And again, that's entirely up to you. You may want to expose learners to new voices or accents, so potentially a recording could be useful if you have one available. But of course, reading it yourself is a lot simpler and often quicker as well. You want to think about how you're going to provide the transcript to the learners afterwards. So are you going to give a copy to each child? Is that going to be electronically or on paper? Will the transcript require a translation, perhaps? Things like that. And lastly, consider how much time you will need and be realistic, because this is not a quick activity if it's done properly. So there needs to be discussion between each stage, and also the length and complexity of the text will play a part. So you need to make sure that there's time as well planned in for the final comparison stage, as that's where the learning happens. And yeah, so take that into account. And I would say it's one of those activities where the more time you tend to devote to it, the more the students get out of it, even if it may not seem like a very efficient use of your time. It can really pay dividends if you spend the right amount of time on doing it, which is why choosing your text carefully is really important. So, right, we're ready to actually do the Dictogloss in class. And as we saw earlier, there are kind of 5 steps here. So I'll just reiterate what those are. So the students are listening, then they write down what they've heard. It's usually important that they listen, at least for the first time, without making any notes as they listen. And that's because we want them to focus on the listening and understanding. It's also because they're going to get to hear the text multiple times again anyway, and they will get a copy of it at the end. So, it's not about how fast you can write. It's not a writing competition. It's about them processing and trying to understand what they are hearing. So the writing should take place after they've listened rather than during. If that is too challenging for your learners, or you're working with learners that might have auditory processing issues or poor working memory, then there are adaptations you can include to make it easier for them, such as providing keywords for them to tick off as they listen or things like that. And we'll talk more about that later. In the third step, then they need to listen again, and potentially again. So as I mentioned before, they probably need to listen at least 3 times for a successful Dictogloss activity, but it could well be more times depending on your text and your students. Then they're going to work in small groups to reconstruct the text, and then kind of write down as much of it as they can, as accurately as they can. And lastly, once they've felt they've done that to the best way they can do it, you give them the final copy of the transcript and they compare their transcript with what they have written, and they can reflect on what they got right and what they've misheard or misunderstood. So just to make this even more concrete, here's a possible sequence. This is certainly how I've often done it with my learners. So I read the text out and the students listen. They individually write keywords. Now, I often scaffold this by saying, okay, first of all, I want you to focus on listening for nouns. And they write the nouns down. The next time, I ask them to listen to verbs. And the next time, adjectives, for example. So by individually writing the keywords down, you're reinforcing them to retrieve that content vocabulary, because often that vocabulary, this is vocabulary that's going to be linked to the topic they've been studying. It's also a good chance for them to practice their spelling as well. And we're not worrying too much about building it up into longer chunks, just getting those words down. Then they listen again. And then there's a pair work section where they can compare with their partner. Oh, what words did you have? What words have I got? And they can pool their ideas together and they can start building up the text into sentences or longer chunks. Again, we can repeat each of those stages as we need to. And then there'll be a third listening phase. And this is where you would then snowball or put the pairs together into larger groups, maybe 4s or 6s around their tables, however your classroom layout allows you to do that, to reconstruct the text. So this is where they need to write down a sort of final version and agree as closely as they can what they've just heard. And then, as I mentioned, the last section, they will compare with the original text. So, comparison and reflection tasks. This is where the magic happens, hence the rabbit in the hat. This is my favorite bit of doing this activity. I love this bit. So you provide the transcript to the learners, and they just collaboratively in pairs or the small groups they've been working in compare the text to their own written response. And basically, you just allow the time for them to discuss. And it's amazing what happens in this moment, this section, because you just don't know what will come up. You don't know what kind of things they're going to have missed or what misunderstandings might have emerged. And there's a lot of really fruitful discussion that's taking place in this section between the students, trying to figure out, oh, I didn't hear that, or oh, I thought that word was that, and I had, there's all kinds of different things that get brought up. This section can be done. I mean, it's great if they're able to do this in English with their peers. That's fantastic. Obviously, if you're working with a group that has a shared home language, especially if they're lower proficiency, you might want to allow them to use that language at this point to discuss, because really it's about the exploration of the ideas and the sort of discussion of the language here. But doing this kind of discussion, this is quite a sort of free-form activity. It's quite a challenging activity cognitively. So it's going to be important to scaffold this discussion with prompts. And that's going to be especially true the sort of younger down the ages you get, and especially if it's the first time you've used the activity as well, before students get familiar with it. So on this slide then, I'm just showing you some examples of possible reflection questions that you could give to your students. And I'll give you a moment just to read those. Okay, and obviously the questions as I've written them here would only really be appropriate at a kind of secondary level for students who have already got a reasonably secure level of English. So we're talking kind of developing competency that's band C or above. However, it would be also quite easy to adapt some of these questions and simplify them. And the questions that I've written here, as you go down, they kind of get more complex and more sophisticated. But um, certainly, even with primary level students, you could simply just ask, what parts of the text were difficult for you, and what questions do you have? Something like that would be enough to prompt some discussion. And obviously, the older they are, the more able they are cognitively to discuss more complex questions, such as how would this text look different in your language? Would it be structured differently? Would you use different kinds of vocabulary? This is the kind of question that's really building on the kind of their language awareness of how English differs to other languages, and by doing that, you're making them aware of the conventions of English compared to perhaps their own language, which can be quite a useful thing for students to have. So yeah, we're promoting that language awareness. At this stage as well, there's also a lot of content understanding going on because students are often they might be talking about language, but they might also be talking about the content of the text in terms of their understanding of it. And again, they're helping each other often with that at this point because they might be explaining words or phrases or definitions and things like that. And as I mentioned, this all builds up this kind of metacognition, this kind of helping them understand how they process language when they're listening to something. And I think a really important realization that I've seen a lot of students get from this is, okay, I didn't hear every single word. I didn't get every single word correctly, but I understood the meaning of the text. Like I got the basic gist of it. It didn't actually matter that I didn't get every single article in the right place, or I missed some of the little unstressed grammar words. So it can actually promote confidence, because it gives them that security that actually it doesn't matter if I don't get every word, as long as I'm getting the overall meaning of this, I'm fine, and I can succeed in this subject. Okay. And then lastly, as I mentioned, we spent all this time picking apart this text and really going into detail on it. So then we want to exploit it. So that could mean analyzing the text further, especially if it's an extract of a longer text, perhaps. Students could, of course, attempt to write their own version if you've used a model as a text. Or, of course, they could just do exercises that are related to the content of the text itself. Now, of course, if you've chosen your text well, you will have chosen a text that's already integral to the task or activity, and it's already part of the lesson or the future lesson that you're doing. So, this shouldn't require any extra work on your part. You're just doing the lesson as originally planned. It's just you've built in a Dictogloss activity at the beginning of it as a way of helping those learners understand that text with more depth and clarity. So again, it should really lead to them being able to succeed better in the next set of tasks that you're doing to them, doing to them. Okay. So in the next section, then we're going to look at some examples or some case studies, basically, of resources that use Dictogloss to develop both content and language, and we'll look at how they do that. So my first example comes from one of our resources on our website for primary students, and it's a geography lesson that is talking about the continents. So this would be a resource, I think, that would be appropriate for new to English or early acquisition learners. Because as you can see, the text here is quite simple and it's been revised to keep the sentences very short and concrete. And if we're going to use this text as a dictogloss, we would assume that the students have already been introduced to the names of the continents and they've been pre-taught some of the academic terms like hemisphere. So this dictogloss then is going to build those learners' ability to use these words within the context of a text. And it's also going to help reinforce or to help develop specific language areas as well. So as we mentioned, the consonant names, it's going to be reinforcing those. Again, this should not be the first time they're encountering those names, otherwise it's going to be too overwhelming. But this is a review, a consolidation. It's going to help them with language for describing places, even at the most simple level. So there are, it is something, it has, and so on. These are, the sort of basic building blocks of language to describe places and locations, which is language that comes up a lot across lots of different topics, but especially obviously in geography. Another grammar point that's going to be really useful to take out of this text is superlatives. We can see them talking about the biggest or the smallest continent. So again, it helps build students' awareness there. And we can also see the use of the pronoun it. So this is connected to kind of writing a coherent text and using the pronoun it to refer to something that's been mentioned earlier in the text. So this is a very simple text, but it's a good example of using the word it. And of course, students to understand the text fully will have to have an understanding that that word it is referring to another word earlier in the text. And again, that's something that we can help point out to them, or they can, understand themselves by reading the text. Okay. Here's another example. This, again, another primary example from our resources. And this one's about, this is a science lesson about light. So as you can see, the language here is probably a little more complex than the previous example, but notice it's still simplified and it's kind of been broken up into chunks to make it a lot more accessible. And there are still adaptations, I would say, for to make it suitable for language learners, because there's no passive voice, for example, and it's avoiding really complex sentence structures. But there's still some quite sophisticated language in there. So certainly this would be appropriate for early acquisition or developing competence learners at bands B and C. And as I mentioned earlier, like if we're doing a dictation exercise at primary level, you're going to be using it with sort of upper primary students because it's students who've got that competency of being able to write already to some degree. Hopefully they should at least be able to independently write sentences or slightly longer texts. So the activity itself here then provides some different options to the teacher. So the first option, Dictogloss A, is one way of doing this task. So in this version, the student listens, then they listen and write down their notes and their words, and then they work with a partner to write full sentences. So this is kind of the model that we were discussing earlier. And this would be, again, for students who are confident enough to listen and write fairly independently. So probably band C and above. And it's going to help them look at things like the word order, because by listening and writing those down, they have to attend very closely to how words are ordered in a sentence in English. It's going to help them think about the text structure. So how are the sentences linked together? What is the structure of this paragraph? And as weird as it may sound for a listening activity, it actually can really help with punctuation. Because if they are writing the text based only on listening to it, they need that understanding of how punctuation affects the rhythm and the pauses that take place in a text. So, it's helping them understand why punctuation is important. And again, this doesn't have to be addressed explicitly. This is something that might just come out naturally when the students are sort of doing the text. So again, if you're an EAL specialist or you're you're comfortable talking about grammar and so on, by all means, make students specifically aware of these things. But if you're not, it's absolutely fine just to kind of let students kind of explore it on their own terms. That's absolutely fine. So that's version A for this task. Same topic, but a slightly more scaffolded version. So in this version, there's a focus on nouns. So the students are asked to listen, but then listen again and tick the words that they hear. So this is much more scaffolded. And I mean, you could argue it's not exactly even Dictogloss, but for a learner who's still developing on their English journey, this might be as close to a true Dictogloss as you're going to get them. So again, it's a way of making it accessible to learners who don't have yet the security with their English to start writing very long texts and interpreting those when they're listening. But it's going to still really help them with their language. So they can still compare it with their partner. Which words did you hear? And then they're going to listen again, and they can still compare the written text to what they listened to. And it's going to help them draw their attention to things like the academic vocabulary that we're using. So, what we would call the tier 3 vocabulary, the jargon, the things like retina, lens, pupil. And of course, the word like pupil is going to highlight some of the complexities of English around having a word that sounds the same with two different meanings. It's also going to highlight things like plurals and how they might be used in English. We've got light rays, for example, is used as a plural. The word lens looks like a plural, but it isn't. And it's also going to draw their attention to things like the use of articles, because in this text, there's lots of articles like the eye, an object, a tree, the lens. And you could even ask them to add, for example, the article that they hear that goes before each word, if that's an area that your students struggle with. And I'm sure we've all taught students who don't speak a language that uses articles, and so that's often something that they find difficult. Yeah, that's a good question. Would you use a picture word map? Yeah, absolutely. That would help support understanding as well. Certainly, you could have visuals to support this. Yeah. And then there's version C, which is actually the same as the previous version, but there's a focus on verbs rather than nouns. So it's exactly the same task. And you could use versions B and C together. The students could do the B version and then they could focus on the nouns and focus on the verbs, or this could be done independently, separately, depending on what you want your learners to focus on. So by focusing on verbs, you're drawing their attention to different elements of the language. So as before, you're focusing them on academic vocabulary, but rather than the sort of tier 3 kind of topic specific vocabulary, you're more focusing them here on what we call the tier 2, the general use academic vocabulary, which is kind of critical for our EL learners. So these are words like travel and bend and turn and enter and bounce, and they can be used across all kinds of different contexts, but they're really important for them to have, because they may not be so used in everyday language, although some of these are. It's also going to be useful to draw attention to grammar and how verbs work, in particular the third person S, because this text is written in the present tense, and in English that means that when you're using the third person, he or she or it, you have to add an S. So we have lots of examples in that text like controls, enters, bends, and that's something that learners habitually struggle with. But again, we're just raising their awareness of that. You don't necessarily expect them to still be able to produce it all the time, especially in their speech. But when they're writing and checking their writing, again, it's a good way of raising their awareness. And the other thing that verbs are really good for raising awareness of, a focus on verbs, is collocations. That means the words that go together commonly. And this is something that, first language or proficient speakers of English kind of have a grasp of without really thinking about it, that our EAL learners need to be taught because otherwise they don't know. So it would be things like words like go through, because these two words go together, bounce off, travel into. So we're building their awareness that these words can be found together. And again, that could be done unconsciously or consciously. So again, for this activity, you might ask the students to write the words that they hear appearing around these words as they listen, as a way of exploring that. Third person S, bane of my life. Yeah, I would say on that point, don't worry about it too much. They've done lots of studies about language acquisition, right? How learners of English as a second language acquire different grammatical features. And it's a funny one because third person S, they get taught at beginner level because it's in the present simple. It's part of the present simple tense. So they learn it at beginner level. All the research shows learners do not start using third person S correctly until they're kind of upper intermediate level. So that's like competent. And so they need to know it in here, but don't expect them to always produce it. And they need to be good at editing their text so that they can correct themselves. But actually, it's fine if they don't use it because it's not a useful part of grammar anyway. It doesn't have any distinction of meaning. And actually, turns out learners don't learn it until they don't actually start using it properly until they're quite well advanced in their English learning journey. So yeah, I would give your students a pass on that one. Anyway, our last case study then is a model exam answer, and this comes from a secondary English literature resource we have on our website on the text "The Woman in Black," which is really common in UK schools. It's one of the recommended texts, so it gets used all the time. And you can see this is the model answer. You could do this as a dictogloss, however you feel the best way of approaching it is. But again, the idea is you're just allowing the students to engage with the meaning of the text more deeply in terms of both the structure and the meaning before they're analyzing it as a model exam answer. And so the resource that we provide has the text, and it also has this analysis of the text, which you can explore after the dictogloss. But yeah, the dictogloss simply provides a way for those learners to familiarize themselves with that model before we start giving them all these exam tips about what they need to include. So again, it's this that principle of them kind of almost discovering it for themselves before you explain it to them. And that's, as we know, very powerful when it comes to learning. That's, if they're able to make those connections themselves, they're much more likely to retain that information and be able to act on it in the future than if we're just explaining to them what they should be doing. So yeah, I mean, I really like Dictogloss for that reason. For me, it's the epitome of a sort of active learning task, which I think is really important in engaging our learners. Okay, for the last section then, we're going to look at some ways that you could adapt your Dictogloss activity for different proficiency levels. And we've already spoken and mentioned about a couple of examples. But we will start by looking at how you might adapt your text to provide more support. So I'm looking here specifically at our new to English or early acquisition learners. So learners who are just starting on their journey of learning English. They're still developing their language. These learners may or may not have really well developed language skills in their home language in terms of literacy. It will depend on your context. But the first thing we can do with these kind of learners is to make sure that we keep our texts short. So this means I would say something between 50 to 80 words is going to be enough. 50 to 80 words. I think all the texts and the examples I've given you are in that area. if you're working with only with new to English learners at Band A, for example, you've got a specialist group for that age, then for that proficiency level, then you may not even want to use a full paragraph. A couple of sentences, 2 or 3 sentences could be fine. And of course, shortening the text may not always be possible, because if you are working with a mixed ability group, you want to keep the text to a level that's going to be useful for everybody. But if you can, keep it short. Related to this is limiting the amount of new or unfamiliar vocabulary, especially if that vocabulary is critical to understanding the text. And this is to just avoid overwhelm by asking students to process new words and new meanings at the same time as you're asking them to recall and reconstruct a text and think about grammar and think about pronunciation and all these different factors. And it's a general rule of thumb, but it's especially true with the REL learners, is never use a decontextualized text for a dictation activity, because it should always be a text where there's some prior familiarity with the topic vocabulary or the story and the characters, if it's a literary text. So in this example that you saw earlier, the text about the continents, I think assuming that we've taught them about the continents themselves, then probably the only sort of new words that are critical would be continent and hemisphere. And because they're occurring very frequently, then this takes us to our next adaptation, which is, it's going to be important to pre-teach key vocabulary in advance. And that's especially for our subject-specific vocabulary. So, and in this resource that focuses on the continents, it provides vocabulary activities to help students do that. So we've got there, you can see the continent names and the northern and southern hemisphere represented as a diagram. The other thing that you may want to do when you're adapting the text is grade the language. And this is a valid approach, especially for our Band A and B learners, but obviously we want to move away from it as the learners develop in their proficiency. So by grade the language, I mean reducing the length of the sentences, avoiding complex structures like passive constructions, preferring familiar or commonly used vocabulary, and this text is a good example of that. If you can, it's best to pitch the text slightly above the level of where your learners are operating, because that's how we're sort of pushing them, nudging them into this next area. And also because generally with language learning, they're able to understand passively through listening more than they can produce when it comes to writing or speaking. Obviously, many of you may have experimented with using AI in your lessons, and this is one of the things that AI is reasonably good at, I would say, is simplifying text. So if you have a text in your textbook that seems very verbose, you can put that into an AI tool and say, can you please simplify this for my EAL learners? And it usually does a reasonably good job. It's not very precise, so it still requires editing. It will still have words and phrases in there that you might want to change. But you can also prompt it to be clear, like do not use passive construct sentences, or you can prompt it to be more specific in how it does that. So that is something to explore when you're adapting texts too. Okay, so we can adapt our texts, but there's also other supports that we can do, and we've mentioned some of those already. So visuals, someone already pointed out, are going to be really powerful. Obviously, they're if you're an EAL specialist, we know this already. Visuals aid understanding, and they can be combined very easily with pre-teaching of vocabulary. But even something as simple as just providing images related to the topic before doing the Dictogloss and asking learners to say what they can see is going to help prepare them for listening, because it's bringing to mind existing vocabulary that they have connected to that topic. And of course, that could be done partly in their home language as well. And then they could translate things into English. So, as an example, here's some visuals from a Dictogloss activity about Charles Dickens with a picture of the man himself, some examples of his novels, and a map I think showing where in England he was born or some kind of event anyway. The next thing we've already mentioned briefly is you can specify the word types for learners to listen to each time you play the text. Again, especially if you are coming at this from an EAL perspective or a language learning perspective, more than a content perspective. So you might want to ask them to first time write the nouns, second time verbs, third time adjectives, for example. You could make this more complex depending on your learners and the types of language that you want to focus on. So, for example, as I mentioned before, nouns often come together with articles. So maybe get them to write down both of them, because we're also then focusing them on kind of chunks of language and also the meaning and how the articles can change the meaning of a word as well. Verbs often go together with prepositions. So if you have a text that has a lot of phrasal verbs where there's a verb and a preposition, this could be a useful thing for students to do, but otherwise they will just write the verb and they may not realize that it's partnered with a preposition that changes its meaning quite significantly. And likewise, adjectives and adverbs. If it's a descriptive text, especially if it's some kind of literary text, often it includes quite a lot of descriptive language, and that will come in the form of adjectives and adverbs. So by doing that together, you're building up a richer picture for those students who are able to cope with that level of detail. And I think it's really important to point out that if you are not a grammar person, if you're a subject teacher and you're like my age, you didn't do grammar at school, you're allergic to it, then that's fine, because we don't have to talk about it in grammatical terms. You can do it in other ways. So you might say, okay, first time you listen to the text, I want you to write down all the people and the things that you hear. Or I want you to write down all the actions, or I want you to write down all the feelings and emotions of the words of describing that. So there are ways around it if you don't want to get involved and bogged down in grammar. The other thing we can do is provide a partial transcript for the learners. So, for example, you may want to give the learners the introductory paragraph of the text and the final paragraph of the text. But then your Dictogloss is the missing section in the middle. And you can provide the beginning and end of the text for the learners to read before they listen. So again, you're providing that context for the text that they will hear, and it's going to help them predict the type of information that they're going to encounter, and that's going to aid comprehension. So it's another way of scaffolding what they're going to hear. And lastly, this probably is true for all students, but especially for our learners who are developing their language, while they're a key part of the Dictogloss process is discussing with the group what you've just heard and what you think the correct answer is, or what you or what the word or phrase you heard and how it looks on the page and so on. So by providing prompts like this, we can facilitate that discussion taking place in English. Can you say that again? What was the word that after or before this? And so on. And so this is sometimes, again, it's easy to overlook this kind of language for doing the task kind of stuff, but this could easily be provided on a word mat or on a screen or something for students to reference to help them have those discussions. Okay, and we might also want to adapt for extra challenge as well. So if we really want to push our students, obviously we could use authentic text, so they haven't been graded, where they're using language as it appears originally. You might ask them to rewrite the text using their own words. And then it gives them an opportunity to borrow some of the vocabulary or the structures that they've learnt when they were listening to it. Obviously, this works well for a model text, but it doesn't have to be. It's also good practice for them paraphrasing and writing things in their own words. And another activity I've seen teachers do successfully is ask students to create their own Dictogloss. So once they're familiar with how the activity works, they could write their own text. Usually ask them to write something a bit shorter than what we were using, maybe like a paragraph at most. Um, Otherwise, it takes too long. And then they can do this themselves in small groups. And again, for our higher level learners, this is really good as well because it's focusing them on their verbal production of the language as well. And this is where things like, how does your intonation and your use of pauses or emphasis correspond to punctuation on the page and this kind of thing as well. So it can be quite again, a really revealing and quite a challenging activity for our students to do. Okay, so that brings us kind of to the end, and I just wanted to finish with a memorable image. So this image to me gets at the core of this activity and why it's valuable. And actually, this is a picture of my daughter from a few years ago when she was at the age where she was exploring everything and learning what happens when you touch different things and put them in your mouth and experimenting with the world, making a big mess around the place. So my concluding messages are in relation to Dictogloss, don't be afraid to experiment with this type of activity. It's okay not to know what things the students will ask you or will pick up on or find challenging. It's okay if it doesn't go as expected. It's that kind of activity. It sometimes goes off in directions you don't expect. It's okay if students start asking grammar questions that you can't answer. So, you can't be the expert on everything. And those questions can often be the starting point for other investigations. So, the students can find out the answers themselves. They can find out from their classmates. Maybe they can ask their EAL teacher or the teaching assistant. It's okay for it to be messy, is what I'm trying to say. That's how we learn most effectively about the world. So these activities can get quite messy. You never quite know where they're going to go. But I think when it's done effectively, Dictogloss is a really brilliant active learning approach to building both language and content understanding. So my recommendation is just to go out there and get your hands dirty, basically. So I think that brings us to the end. And just really, if there's any questions, we've got a few minutes, I think.
Yeah,
2 minutes.
Thanks so much, Tom. I'm a huge fan of Dictogloss myself, so it was very, very interesting to hear what you were talking about. In response to a question here, yes, if feel free to share the recording with colleagues or your networks. We will send out an email tomorrow. If you've got any burning questions, do put them in the chat. Can this work also with numeracy is one of the questions in the chat.
Well, I think the example I gave earlier, which is I was thinking about this in terms of word problems. So word problems with maths are often a really big barrier for our EAL learners. So I was thinking you could do the word problem as a dictogloss because you're just exploring that language and you're scaffolding that language and you're helping them understand the meaning of the question and the language involved. And then they can move on to the maths aspect of solving it, if you see what I mean. So yeah, I would think it would work in that sense. Absolutely. Anything where there's text. So again, it could be any topic. It could be maths, it could be science, it could be music, it could be PE, it could be absolutely anything. It's just yeah, that's the beauty of it, really.
Right, thanks, Tom. And we do have a few questions. There was one for tips to you for using Dictogloss with mixed ability groups, I assume. I would say just combining some of the approaches you've mentioned, wouldn't it? Like maybe some students getting extra scaffolding.
Yeah, it does depend on the spread of levels. So I think if it's a reasonably, if they're reasonably close to each other, it can work quite well to have sort of a band A or a band B or a band C person working together, for example. But it's not going to work successfully if you've got a band D and a band A person. So for those, you might want to put students into the groups and use some of the strategies we've talked about to scaffold for certain groups more than others in terms of the what you're expecting them to do in the task, perhaps.
Yeah, yeah. And I think there's a very good point in the chat now as well about it would be a valuable activity to use with all students, not just
Absolutely.
EAL
Yep.
learners.
Yep. Yeah,
Right.
definitely.
Well, and I'm really sorry if we didn't manage to answer your questions because our time is up. But thank you again, Tom, for today's presentation. Before we finish, I just wanted to let you know that, yes, we will send out a recording of the webinar with all the useful links tomorrow. Unfortunately, we're not able to share the slides, but you will have access to the full recording, obviously, and you'll be able to see the slides on the screen. And I also wanted to make you aware that we've published our course schedule for the next academic year. So if you're interested in any online training courses on supporting EAL learners, we have got courses for various roles. The first course running will be for EL coordinators on the 10th of September. And then on the 18th of September, we have a course for classroom practitioners on assessing the language proficiency of learners who use EAL. I've put a link into the chat, but you will find information about all the courses on our website. And you also have the opportunity to sign up to our newsletter if you want to hear about future webinars, for example, or any future training that we do. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending today's session. I hope you found it useful. And we'll look forward to seeing you in the next academic year.
Thank you very much, everyone. Goodbye.